Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Tuba People TV, where we talk about Arnold Jacobs all of the time. Puddles and I are here in the lovely studio of Rodney Dorsey here at the Jacobs School of Music on the campus of Indiana University with none other than Bryan Heath. Bryan, so good to see you.
You too. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Likewise, I've heard about Bryan from fellow friends, Pete Ellison and Henry Henniger for several years, but this is our first time meeting.
Yes.
So I'm excited to have this conversation. Bryan is the bass trombonist with the Louisville Orchestra, and he earned his DMA here at Indiana University, his master's from here at Indiana University, and also got his Bachelor of Music from Murray State. And you were in school there with John Whitaker, right?
I was.
Yeah, so along the way, you had some studies with Arnold Jacobs.
Yes, sir.
And I'm just wondering what you can tell us about those initial, what brought you to him, and et cetera.
Well, as a high schooler, I knew John actually as a high schooler before I ever met him at Murray State. But before that, I had been introduced about my sophomore year in high school to the Chicago Symphony by a guy named Eugene Montgomery, another professional bass trombone player. I had never even heard of the Chicago Symphony. I didn't know what a performance major was. I didn't know you could be an orchestral musician. I didn't know you could actually do that and get paid for it. So once he told me that turned my direction quite a bit, because I just thought at that point, oh, if you're a music person, you're a band director, and orchestra people, that's just a hobby. Mm-hmm. So Eugene introduced me to the Chicago Symphony, and immediately I was smitten with them. And actually, we came here, I think it was 1993, the CSO low brass folks came through. It was Jay Friedman and Mulcahy, Charlie Vernon, mm-hmm. and actually Floyd Cooley was playing that year.
That year, right.
So this cemented it. I knew I had to be one of those guys. I mean, at that point, there was one direction. There was really nothing else that I wanted to do other than be an orchestral trombone player. So I started following them, looking at more recordings. And I had a great teacher at Murray State as a high schooler before I got there, Raymond L. Conklin. And to this day, he is still, he's passed on as of a couple of years ago, but still one of my greatest mentors, mm-hmm. I mean, of all of my teachers. But he was very kind and encouraging and allowing me to go and work with other people, like these Chicago folks. So initially, at that point, as a freshman in college, I didn't know who Arnold Jacobs was yet, mm-hmm. but I remembered Michael Mulcahy, and I was a tenor player at the time, so I was more interested in the tenor. And I was trying to get a lesson with him. Mm-hmm. So I don't know who gave me his phone number. Somebody gave me his phone number, and I was leaving him messages all the time. And he was busy, so he was not willing to take me at the time, but he's like, hey, look, why don't you go and find Ed Kleinhammer first, and here's Arnold Jacobs, and here's some phone numbers. So I thought, Ed Kleinhammer, I do know that name. Mm-hmm. So I started with him, 1994. It was Halloween, and I drove up to Barrington, Illinois from Murray State, and had that first lesson. And it was amazing. It was so good. It was 3 hours for $100. And during that lesson, he started off, he's like, I just want you to know, I'm not the end. He said, I done pretty good. He's like, but said, I'm not the end. So he's like, you need to also search out these people, and he named Arnold Jacobs, and very, very affectionately so, and referred to him as his partner in the orchestra mm-hmm. for 45 plus years, however many that was. And then, so it's like, okay, so I will look into that. So by that next summer, no, I couldn't afford another lesson right away, because as a college freshman, $100 was a big deal, plus a trip, and we bought Giordano's Pizza and Eli's Cheesecake at the end of that, my college roommate and I. So the next summer, I had an opportunity, though, to actually get my first lesson with Mr. Jacobs. By this time, I heard more about him, and it was almost mythical. I mean, it was legendary. People were like, oh, he's the guy who's only got one lung, right. And it's so many it's stuff of legend. Yeah. So I called him up, and hello, this bellowing voice, which was great, and just tried to see if I could get a lesson. He's like, well, sure, come on up, and let's hear what a civilian sounds like. So I'm like, okay. So that summertime, I did that. I couldn't drive that far. My mom still wouldn't let me drive that, so I wound up catching a Greyhound bus from Evansville, Indiana, up to Chicago. I was supposed to get there in just a few hours. missed a layover. It wasn't my fault. The layover bus didn't make it, and wound up taking that bus all night long. So I didn't get to sleep at all before that lesson, but I was so wired and just excited. And like I said, I was hungry at the time, and I wanted to be good now. I wanted to be good yesterday. So I had borrowed a book from my teacher, Mr. Conklin, and it was the Philip Farkas Art of Brass Playing book. And man, I'm just devouring that thing. I read it all night long on the bus. And I was actually a little bit, I was kind of proud of that at the time. So I get to my lesson with Mr. Jacobs, and I just kind of dropped that. I'm like, hey, I just finished reading this book. And he's like, I see. It's like, yeah, he's like, Philip Farkas was amazing, and that's great. You should lock that in a drawer.
Yeah.
I mean, everything that I had just built up, I would just kind of crumbled for a second. And he's like, but if I write a book, you should also lock that in a drawer. Like, okay. He's like, see, these are great truths. And he's like, but as human beings and performers, we simply don't function this way. It's like, yeah, and we would get into more of that as we went along.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my very first opening with him. And then actually I got into the lesson, started playing for him a bit. I think I started with David Concertino, and I think I made it maybe 8 or 15 bars in, and already he's making some pretty serious diagnosis.
Yeah.
And he said, he said, it's good news. He's like, I don't really have anything remedial that I want to work on with you. I was young. I wasn't afraid of anything at that point.
Sure.
But immediately he's like, you're making these sounds, and he's like, you're not even breathing. He's like, so he's like, yeah, I can watch your body, and he's like, you have good posture, and you have a nice tone, but he's like, yeah, you're not even respirating on the instrument here. So he pulls out the 6-liter bag, and he's like, here, show me about this, fill this up for me. And I did. And he's like, look, you filled that bag, and he's like, you didn't even take a breath. And he's like, yeah, this is terrible. He said,
yeah.
Said, you're somatotype. You're a larger guy. What, you're like 6'2", 6'1"? I was like, yeah. And he's like, I said, it's actually worse for you to not use your full capacity than it is a smaller person who has to breathe all the time. And I had no idea why at the point. And then at this point, he launches into basically a lesson in anatomy, which I was a big fan of anatomy. Anyway, that was one of my favorite classes in high school. And basically started off teaching me where my lungs were. And I said he pulled out his Thin Man chart and his scientific graphs and all of that. And he's like, yeah, if you place your fingers just behind your collarbones there, he said, your lungs go up that high. And he said, if you follow down the sternum to the xiphoid process there, your lungs go down that low, and then kind of trace along the ribs in the back, and they go a little lower there. And he's like, oh, by the way, where's the diaphragm? I'm like, oh, okay. He's like, it's right here. So he gave me a lesson just on where everything was, and I'm like, well, okay, that's great. And he said, yeah, but I can see that you're affected somewhat by some of these older school traditions where it's like you're really keeping your body quite rigid. You're not allowing your shoulders to move. You're not allowing your chest to move. And I'm like, well, right, that's good though, right? And he's like, no. He said, imagine your lungs as basically being a balloon, and what happens to a balloon if air goes into those lungs or into that balloon? And so I'm like, well, okay, that's easy, and I can see it in my brain. He always had me think of things, and it's like it gets bigger. And he's like, okay, well, what happens when the air leaves that balloon? It gets smaller. And he's like, okay, so anywhere in your body that you have lungs, if there's air going into it, you're going to get some expansion. And when the air leaves that area, it's going to, deflate, reduct. And he said, do this for me. He's like, move your shoulders up and down. So he's like, okay, you're not moving any air. He said, move your chest up and down. He's like, great, you're not moving any air. I said, move your belly in and out. And I did it. He's like, now look, you're not moving any air by doing these motions. So this is correct. These are not motions that are going to do you any good. He really liked the psychology of how to function with this. So he gave me a thought to work with. And he said, look, put your fingers here. simply suck air past your fingers, past your lips, until you can't suck in anymore, allowing your body the freedom to go ahead and expand. And he had me watching myself in a mirror as I did this, and it did. I could see it. I saw my thoracic region get larger, and he said, now go back and forth and feel that air going outside the body. Of course, he didn't say air. He said, this is the phenomena of wind.
Right.
He said, wind is the phenomena of air in motion, always in motion, never static, outside the body. He didn't like me thinking about anything inside. He said, anything behind my lips didn't matter. He said, God gave us really great controls in our brain, that if we just focus on, I simply want the air to go in. It's like turning my car wheel. I want to go left, I turn the wheel left. I want to go right, have
easy control.
Stop and go. So he had me focusing on that, and then he had me watching my body in the mirror as I would focus on simply this. Now, he then went on to go further into why it mattered. I had mentioned about why it was worse for me, being a larger guy, to not make use of this air. And he said, a couple different things. Air under compression, like someone who squeezes, it's actually the same as having less air. But he did this. He said, okay, just take a really great breath for me. Sit tall in your chair. So he said, and I'll tell you what to do after that. So I take it in. He said, just take as much as you can. He said, let go. So I do it. He says, okay, now push the rest of it out. And he's like, look, that's still like 50% right there. He said, this first top. He said, the first part just falls out on its own. You don't even have to try to get that air out of the body. And he said, it's so much easier. And he said, it's because I'm thinking, of course I want to play longer phrases, bigger breaths, that's why. And he's like, no. He's like, okay, do this again. And he had me actually taking that breath and playing a note. And just by even doing that, the sound becomes fuller, because it's just easier getting that air out of my body. I don't have to push it and force it out as much. So, immediately that was one of the main reasons as to why I needed this fuller breath. The first lesson really was the only lesson that I had with him where he spent a bunch of time on the breath. After that, it changed a bit. But another, in that same category of the wind, he got me to do it. This one stuck with me forever, the concept of thick air versus thin air. And this is one of my predominant thoughts to this day. This has never left me. But he had me, he's like, okay, he would draw the two lines. He had one line representing the amount of airflow going past the lips versus back pressure or resistance behind the lips. And he said, okay, this is the picture of thick air. And he would say, okay, if I reversed it, this would be thin air. So he said, make the sibilant of an S. He said, blow it on the back of your hand. So I'm like, and he's like, no, do it even harder. And he's like, that's pretty terrible, right? He's like, this is horrible for trombone playing. And then he takes my hand. Can I see your hand?
Yeah.
And he goes, and he said, this is thick air. And his resonant voice, and then he's like, do that on your own. And he's like, this is what you want for trombone playing. And he said, this is an abstract. He said, it's not something that is exact for every area that you play in, but this is kind of an ideal. So for me, like whether I'm playing high or low, loud or soft, I always have this concept of that voluminous air with that, and that's, what really is my concept of wind for me. But then he said, so after he had gone into all of his anatomy lessons, and then he starts talking about the function of nerves, and he said, you have motory nerves and you have sensory nerves. He said the motory nerves are the ones that send the signal to your chops, and the sensory nerves are the ones that feel things in your chops. He said, so this is why you have a hard time playing by feel, because the nerves aren't even in the same place. And he said, it's just you won't get there like that. And then he went on about all of these things for a while, and then he was basically, but He said, forget all of this now.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, we just had a 45-minute lesson on all of these really cool, and I'm digging it. Like, I am so analytical and all these things. Like, man, I don't know how this is going to make me good, but I'm going to get so much better through this. And he's like, okay, now forget all of this, except for the thick air. He's like, the song is the dominant thought in your brain. So, okay, and then he proceeds to tell me what the song is. He said, the song is the entire picture of everything that you want to convey to your audience. It's the pitch, it's the note, it's the dynamic, it's the musicianship, it's the tone, it's everything about it. And he said, it's your story. He said, as musicians, we have to be storytellers of sound. And he said, this is the thing that is the most dominant in your brain. And then wind is slightly secondary to that. He said, sometimes you might reverse it a little bit. Mm-hmm. He said, he said that he had studied these things on his own a lot. Like when in his younger days, he was in hospitals. He had doctor friends, and he's so fascinated by this. And he figured out all of these mechanical things. And then even after his in-depth study into that, he found that that's not where it is. He said, these are good things to know. He said, but the psychology of what motivates function is not that. He said, you can't play by a diaphragm. You can't play by a lip and an embouchure. He said, you really have to, as human beings, we function in the pursuit of products. And that picture in the brain is a very specific product to go for. He said, then we have systems of muscles. He would, I don't remember what he tossed. It may have been a pencil in the lesson, but like without even saying anything, he just
toss you a pencil,
chucks a pencil at me, and I catch it. And he's like, see, he's like, you're not even thinking about what you're doing with that. He's like, you just want to grab it. It's like, if I want to take a drink, and he has like a glass of water, and he has a skull, which he told me later was Norse and Viking, talking about the skulls of the dead that they conquered. And then he would take a drink. He said, if I had to think about, contract the bicep, contract the intercostal muscles on the other side,
in order to catch the pencil.
Exactly. Or taking the drink. He's like, I'm gonna die of thirst before I ever get the epiglottis out of the way, and all of these things. He's like, so we don't function as human beings under these kind of conditions.
Right. Bryan, this is amazing for me because you're basically describing my first few lessons with Jake, with Mr. Jacobs, and all of this information rushing at me, these fancy words and everything, but forget about all that. But I'm wondering what, if anything, did you notice about how you would then play in the lesson after all this?
Well, immediately, upon just introducing the thick air to the instrument, that volumized the sound in a big way right away. But that was generic. Like that wasn't exact. That was just one piece of what he was going for. I had mentioned about the picture of the song in the brain, and he got way more specific at that point. And he's like, well, who do you like? And I'm like, oh gosh, I like Charlie Vernon. He's one of my heroes. I think he's got the greatest legato I've ever heard, and this voluptuous bass trombone sound. And he's like, okay, well, do this for me. He's like, I want you to imagine. Can you hear it in your brain? Yeah, I think I can. He's like, okay, now turn up that volume. Like, okay, can you hear that? And he'd say, go back. Can you remember what you sounded like? And I was like, yeah, I can. And he's like, okay, turn up Charlie Vernon in your brain one more time. And I think he may have even had me pull out Roshu number 2 at that point. He's like, can you hear Charlie playing this? So I'm like, yeah. He's like, so do you like to do impersonations? I was like, oh yeah. As a kid, I always loved doing impersonations. So he said, do me an impersonation of Charlie Vernon. Show me what Charlie would sound like on that. And I had already played it my way. And then immediately, and he's like, obviously Charlie's a much better player than you are. So I'm like, okay. And then he would chuckle about it a little bit, and he said, this is great. He's like, this is not something you have to wait for. He's like, now, I want you to know, he's like, this is not you doing this. This is me doing this for you. I'm guiding you through this right now. He's like, but you're doing it right away. You can do it. He's like, yeah, this is where you need to live. You need to take this home and, have that sort of dominant and specific sound in there. in your brain.
He was teaching you how to teach yourself.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he did that for everybody, because I studied with him. I had about 17 lessons or so over the span of 2 or 3 years. So after that first lesson, like most of the things that we would ever talk about in the future were covered in that first lesson. But I'm still unpacking that first lesson, 25 years later. Maybe it's more than that now. But so I knew I needed more of it, and I needed to make it mine. So I decided that next summer, Murray's a small town, and Mr. Conklin, like I said, he was as good as gold and as great as anybody that I ever worked with. But I wanted more, so I actually called up Mr. Jacobs again the following summer, and my mom helped me out, and she's like, well, hey, let's see what we can do. And she got me a room at the Herman Crown Center, which is the dorm for Roosevelt College. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Jacobs said, can I get a few lessons this summer? And he's like, well, okay, sure. And I wound up working full-time at the Tower Records, mm-hmm. right behind, which used to be the old Rose Records, behind Orchestra Hall. Yep. And at that point, so I was able to get weekly lessons with him that summer, which was great. And he was always so positive. Like I would call him on the phone, and again, hello, and how's the boy? And just made me feel really good. And I did one more summer beyond that, and the third summer, this would have been after my junior year in college. I found a room for rent in Alsip, Illinois. I mean, we're talking like literally just an attic room with the aunt and uncle of my college roommate. Okay. And I didn't know how I was going to make this work. But I was so broke, I'm a college kid, and I didn't have a job. So again, though, I called up Mr. Jacobs, and I was like, I really want to continue working with you this summer. What can I do? And I said, hey, do you need any yard work done? So he was like, okay. He said, you're on scholarship. So we started doing that. So I would get weekly lessons. This was his house on Maplewood. I never got to go to the house on Normal and see all of that. But so he had me out there pulling weeds out of the roses, and then trimming hedges and all sorts of stuff like that. And then it's funny, like the the trade-off, the quid pro quo, was much more in my favor than his, because I think he and Gizzy, they would feel bad for me out there in the Chicago summertime heat, and I would be out there working in the dirt, and they would just call me in, and they had Nutter Butter cookies and these funky little chocolate sodas and other flavored sodas, and kind of a cluttered kitchen. Yeah. And we would go into the kitchen, and I would just sit there in the AC with him and Gizzy, and they had just a small TV on the table, and they'd watch Star Trek: The Next Generation while I'm eating Nutter Butter cookies and chocolate soda, and it was magical. And the stories that he would tell, and he would tell me nicknames that he had for certain conductors, which I can't really repeat at this point. But so we're sitting there watching Star Trek: The Next Generation, and he's like, oh, I used to play in the orchestra with his dad. Talking about John Delancey. And I was like, cute. So he would have me go and pick up sliders sometimes.
White Castle.
Yeah, White Castle. And then there was an Italian beef place down the road, so I would go and pick up that. So there were several times I'd get to go and just hang out and have supper with him there.
That's great.
And it was just one of the greatest things ever for me.
Yeah, wow, wonderful. Yeah. That's great. So Bryan, what you had that crash course on the respiration, anatomy, the nervous system, that first lesson, and then forget all about it. What came after that in the subsequent lessons?
Really, just a dominance on just developing my art form. He said, you need to be challenging yourself all the time. He said, limited challenges produces a limited musician. And he would talk about, so I would go home in the privacy of my studio and play Scheherazade, the violin solo, and all of that. So he's like, you really need to be expanding and doing all these things. Now, so the concepts, song and way, it's just about as simple as you can get. In concept. But conquering my brain and getting out of my own way, there were times that the lessons were not easy, and I had some difficulties. And he's like, you're not doing what I'm asking you to do. I'm like, I'm trying to. He's like, no, you're still thinking about something else. You're not focusing on this sound. And then he would redirect me like that anytime it would get weird. And then I had one point, I had actually sort of mistaken some of what he had told me. He was very big into relaxation. So somehow I translated relaxation
into flaccidness.
Into total flaccidness. Mm-hmm. And I'm playing in one particular lesson and kind of falling apart. And I was like, yeah, I'm just really trying to be relaxed. And, he pulls out, his eyes were kind of going bad at that point. He pulls out a magnifying glass and he's getting close to my embouchure here. And he's like, oh yeah, no, it still needs to be firm. He said, you still have to have an embouchure. So yeah, a lot of that, just after that, it was a lot of reinforcement of those things. And it's funny to me, like, sometimes I think people, there are those folks who are huge Arnold Jacobs fans, and it's King James Bible.
Right.
It's that.
Right.
And then there are those who are the opposite, and they're like, no, I like the NIV better, and I don't believe this. And they're like, oh, well, Jacobs he didn't ever address embouchure or anything like that, but he did with me. But he did it in such a way that he was the one controlling it. He still had my focus on my artistry and how to get there, and he was the one behind the scenes tweaking things. And he told me one time that he would say things almost black and white different from one student to the next, because he understands the psychology of how to get the function, that whatever student needs to think about in order to do that. Like when I interviewed Dick Erb, that was such a funny story. I think he said the same thing in your interview, and he's like, a few weeks after his lesson, some things were going really well, and then he calls him up on the phone, and he's like, yeah, I used to have this really great high range, and now it's failing me. And he's flipping through his notes, and Mr. Jacobs was, because he took notes on all the students. And he's like, oh, you should have called me sooner. and Dick Erb is like, oh no, I blew it. I've waited too long. I didn't know this was a problem. And he's like, no, it's okay. He's like, I changed your embouchure. He's like, what? And so I don't believe that Mr. Jacobs was oblivious to any of these things and the importance of them. Sometimes I feel like people look at Song and Wind as like voodoo and wishful thinking, but it's Mr. Jacobs was not WebMD, and this was one of the reasons why I think that he was so apprehensive about publishing his own book, because people read things and you don't have basically the psychologist of him to help guide you through it. It's like when you take aptitude tests. He would speak about those sometimes and say, you really need a psychologist with you to guide you through these things and do that. So, yeah, I feel like in a one-on-one lesson, he may not even tell you until after the fact what he did in changing those things. So there may have been some things along the way that I didn't even realize he was tweaking at the time, but he would say just such a thing and make me better because of it.
Yeah, for sure. He was definitely working in the background. He was like the open app in your mind.
I was pretty fortunate in those earlier days. Like, I was so young that, like I said, I was kind of bulletproof, and I wasn't afraid of anything. I hadn't fallen on my face yet, And then it wasn't until after Mr. Jacobs was gone that I ever really hit the rocks and really wound up in some hard straits. My goodness, he's gone now. I mean, this was, I was a professional player already. I had been advancing in auditions and coming close and subbing with a lot of orchestras. And then, I came up with my first big time problem, and I didn't know how I was going to get past it. And I'm just like, my goodness, I mean, I've worked with the best. I've worked with Mr. Jacobs, and now he's gone, and we never addressed this. I didn't get to ask him these questions. And I wound up with quite a severe Valsalva maneuver.
Mm.
And I mean, it wasn't through lack of practice. It was through much practice. I was prepping for a really big audition, and it was going great for a bit. Then, actually, a miracle happened. And this is, like you're saying, exactly what you're doing, helping this legacy to stay alive. So I'll backtrack just a second. So when I was doing my master's degree here with D. Stewart, he knew I was a student of Mr. Jacobs. That's why I chose to work with Mr. Stewart. I wanted to continue along those lines. And he told me about this treasure that existed from 1984, the Second International Brass Congress. And he's like, I have these videos. He said, no one has seen these videos. They've been locked away in the bottom of my filing cabinet at that point for nearly 20 years. So he's like, what are we going to do about this? So we made a special topics class, and he's like, okay, we're going to devote this class to restoring these videos. So I took them back to John Wininger, who filmed the original ones over at IU Telecom, and he's like, okay, yeah, we'll transfer these back, and I got class credit for it. So now I actually get to see these videos from 1984. Mark Lawrence looks like a young movie star, and everybody has hair, quite a bit of hair. And it was great, like even just watching those. So then we, between Mr. Stewart and myself, we came up with the idea of what would it be like to follow up. And I didn't even know your project was going around this time. I just had those videos, and I thought, man, it's between 25 and 30 years later. What do they say now? What if I ask them the same questions, and are they still valid? How has it evolved? And so we're like, great, this is your final project. This is a really good project. So we decided to turn it into a video documentary. So I took all of the older footage, and then I went to almost all of them. Ron Bishop had sadly already passed away at that point. But I went to that. I went to Dick Erb's house. I went to Charlie Vernon's house. I went to San Francisco and Mark Lawrence's floating house. And there were a couple that I didn't have a passport, so I had to ship some GoPros. But in the process of this is where I found my miracle. Because Dick Erb was the first one that I went to. And I'm sitting there in the house, and he starts to tell me about some difficulties that he had and why he went to Mr. Jacobs. And I didn't even want to reveal to anybody that I was going through this thing. I mean, I had, at this point, this was shortly, I got runner-up for the Atlanta Symphony. George Curran won, and I was at the heels. And then shortly after that, this thing happened, and I didn't know why. And I didn't want to tell anybody because I did not want to, I'm subbing all over the place, and I don't want to have people stop using me because they think I'm broken. And I didn't even know why it was coming on. I just started not being able to start my notes. And I went from like really going up, and I was like, well, man, if I can't start the notes, there's no way I'm going to win an audition. It's like, even if once I get them going, like the excerpt is pretty good. So during that first interview, when I'm talking with Dick Erb, I'm hanging on every word. We're sitting there in his house, and he's describing this thing, and then he's like, do you want to know what happened? And I was like, dear Lord, please, yes. And he tells me, without me, I didn't even tell him about my difficulty with that. And then he describes exactly what I was going through. And he's like, yeah, I went up to Chicago because his buddy in New Orleans said, yeah, I think Ross had sent him up. And he's like, you need to go see Jake. So he's like, so I did. And it changed my life forever. He said, I stayed there for, I think it was a couple of weeks, and he had a couple of lessons during the period. And then he said, it never happened again. Because he was going through the same. He said, go to play a middle B flat. And that's exactly what I was doing. And he's like, do you want to talk about this? And I'm like, yes, please. And he just described, all of these things that were happening. And I was very fortunate in mind that I was doing exactly the same that he was. I had mentioned earlier, like Mr. Jacobs was very opposed to any static pressures building up in the body, and not only just for airflow's sake, but the body is conditioned. The Valsalva maneuver is a very appropriate your body's supposed to do that for particular functions in life, childbirth, and others. But it's not desirable at all for trombone playing. So what I had somehow slipped into, I had started placing my tongue long before I ever started playing it. I didn't even realize I had started doing it. And then kind of compressing inside there. And then once that compression hit, it would almost take an explosion to finally get it out. Dick Erb said, "It's like, yeah, you can place this and it sets very nicely, and that's your body is doing exactly what you're telling it to. You're not failing, you're just achieving the wrong thing." Mm-hmm. And he said that tongue just needs to be in the bottom of your mouth like a dead fish, like doing nothing until this light little flick, after the air. I mean, Mr. Jacobs would do this thing, and I just didn't get it back at the time because I was so young and I didn't have a problem. On paper, he would draw an articulation for me, and rather than a giant capital T followed by a little AH or little OH, ta or toe, ta, he would draw a lowercase t or a D with a capital gigantic AH or OH. So it's so much more air forward,
right? And
the tongue, it was just all simultaneous rather than a prep. So I tried this same thing, and I'm with great fear and trembling. I'm going home. Is this the key? Is this the same thing? Did Dick Erb just cure me or did Arnold Jacobs just cure me? From beyond via Dick Erb. Mm-hmm. And by golly, I came back to IU and I started doing that, and I was just started practicing some air attacks, leaving the tongue out of the way, and it never happened again. Now, the fear of it didn't go away for a while, because I had been kind of traumatized by it.
Yeah.
But that's not the only one. So in each one of these lessons, each one person probably had one or two really good gems in the process that I got a lot better through. And this is long after I'd worked with him. So it's like, there are all these stories. Everybody's, Mr. Jacobs saved my career. Mm-hmm. And I would like to have that. Even now, I would love to go back and say, I've experienced this. I don't know what to do with this, And, his concepts, I do believe that they work. But sometimes I would need someone like you or Dick Erb to coach me through, and not just, like I said, it's not WebMD, right, where it's like, oh my gosh, I think I have cancer or hemorrhoids. I don't know which one, But there's a lot of odd diagnosing that happens that way. Yeah. So, but yeah, through these people and through these projects, got so much good stuff, and it's alive and well, through those people.
Yeah. Bryan, those tapes, Mr. Stewart sent them to me, or the DVDs or something. I can't remember in what format, but I during COVID, I didn't travel around interviewing people. But what I did do was to make use, at least the first year of COVID, is I chopped up the Oprah show into little bite-sized pieces based on topic, which of course, as you know, Mr. Jacobs would go start on one topic and then like, whoa, and then over here, and it's like, whoa, there's so much information in this. But anyway, it was a really, I always thought that I was so grateful to Mr. Stewart for having the presence of mind to actually have Jacobs in a setting like that with really great video technology, because it really seemed to me it matched the level of the master.
Oh yeah.
Rather than just some VHS tape, that sort of thing. It really helped to get that message out there, because in as much as we watch, we evaluate with our eyes what we quality, what we think we're listening to.
I loved so many. Like, I have some bootleg recordings, of the famous master classes that would go on at Northwestern,
right?
And even some videos from that sort of thing. But yeah, having that presentation where it was like the panel and just seeing all the faces of people who were there, it was world class. Yeah,
it really was. And so many. You talk about not taking. It's bad for you to only breathe halfway. Steve Chenette, in the audience, and him talking about working with Jeanette, and Dee saying, "Is that all you can remember about somebody after 22 years?" It's great stuff.
He's huge, one big lung. Yeah.
One big lung, and if you saw his tongue, you'd say it's a horse's tongue, and Steve sticks out his tongue. Anyway, it's so that's been a really great resource, I think, to get out there, and your project is really valuable.
Thank you.
Really thank you for taking the time to do that. And Puddle's always he's always reminding me to really show my gratitude, and so we'd really like for you to have this Song and Wind full 20-ounce coffee mug as a token of our appreciation.
Thank you so much. I have a serious coffee addiction, and this is going to be my new favorite mug. Thank you very, very much.
It's great to meet you.
You too.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
And now back to you.